ultimately, I predicted that what was universally believed at the time, that mice had long telomeres, that would be false, and that it would be discovered if we were to study the telomeres of wild mice, that they would have short telomeres just like people and other mammals. And so it would be a laboratory artifact that had created the long telomeres in mice that had been measured so many times. And if that was true, that had dramatic implications for not only the study of wound healing, of cancer, of senescence, all of the things that we would use mice as a model organism for, but it also had very direct implications for pharmaceutical safety, because those same mice are used to test compounds to see whether or not they are toxic, right? So toxic that you wouldn't want to release them as a pharmaceutical. Now, the problem is what I hypothesized was that a selective force in the breeding colonies from which laboratory mice come, based on the fact that younger mice breed faster than older mice, and because these entities that produce lab mice are sensitive to how expensive it is to produce a saleable mouse, they breed younger mice because it's more cost effective. What that does is it means that those mice in those colonies don't live long enough to get cancer. And so it takes this delicate trade-off and it unbalances it wildly in the direction of long telomeres are good because they reduce the pathologies of aging. So they are selected for in mouse colonies. But the problem is, if you take a mouse who has long telomeres, that mouse is condemned to get cancer. Virtually all laboratory mice die of cancer if you give them the opportunity. They live shorter lives than wild mice because they don't have this delicate balance. They're unreliable models of cancer because they're so prone to it that they are unlike people. But worst of all is they will be disproportionately resilient to toxins that are not so deadly that they outright kill the animal, right? A toxin that is just simply very bad for the animal, that kills tissue but doesn't kill the animal outright, is something that such a mouse can compensate for because they have effectively an infinite capacity to replace their cells. And worse than that, the fact that these animals are condemned to get tumors means that if you give them a toxin that is bad for them but not deadly, it may extend their lives by slowing down their tumors. It functions like chemotherapy because the way chemotherapy works is cells that are in the process of dividing are more vulnerable than cells that are in a static phase. So when you get chemotherapy because you have cancer, the idea is we give you a poison and it's bad for you, but it's worst for your tumor. And you kill the tumor faster than you kill the patient. In mice that have these latent tumors, giving them a toxin may extend their lives. And so when you say, well, is this compound safe enough to give to people? Well, I don't know. It extended the life of these mice. Maybe it's not bad. Well, maybe what you just discovered is that it's a toxin and that it's not going to be very good for people, and that mice are or laboratory mice are a very unreliable model.
So one of the many problems, is that there are so many sign changes in that story that it's very hard to explain to an audience that isn't already informed. And the audience that is already informed, that is to say, those researchers who work on things like telomere and senescence and cancer, don't want to hear it.
Well, they don't want to hear it, but they don't have any right not to hear it.
No, they don't.
That's the problem.
But it's a story that is particularly easy for the public to miss. Not that the public hasn't been forced to miss a whole lot of stories that shouldn't have been easy to miss at all, but this one is easy to miss because it's going to be a really hard sell for a story whose soundbite is, this drug is bad for you because it being poisonous helped the mice that it was tested on to live longer.
Agreed. But all I would say is, look, people in the public, this isn't their job, right? There are institutions whose job this is, right? The FDA should be absolutely obsessed with discovering whether or not this is an accurate description of the universe. Instead, the blue ribbon panel that was assembled after the Vioxx scandal put together a 300-page book called The Future of Drug Safety, in which telomeres are not mentioned, Mice are not mentioned. Rodents are not mentioned, right? The book doesn't contain anything in the neighborhood of this question. It doesn't falsify the idea. It just simply pretends there's nothing to talk about.
Yep.
And my point would be, under normal circumstance, let's say science screwed up badly, and that this thing somehow didn't get noticed 20 plus years after the fact. It finally dawns on somebody that
This thing being your paper.
Yeah, my paper and the model that it proposes. Okay, so they're 20 years late. Shouldn't Gina Colada now be calling up the people who she interviewed to report this story and saying, wait a minute, was this predicted?
Mm-hmm.
You know, shouldn't she be digging up my paper and saying, wait a second, didn't I just report a story in which this appeared to be some brand new surprising result? And in fact, here I'm looking at a published paper in a respectable journal in which the exact thing is described ahead of time by 2 decades, right? Shouldn't that happen? Right?
Yes,
what
it
about,
should.
you know, where's Nicholas Wade? I certainly contacted him about this. Carl Zimmer. Shouldn't Carl Zimmer be buzzing with, wait a second, I heard about that 20 years ago. What happened? Why is this not in the story? And yet they're not going to, because this is a cozy club of people who are effectively, they are doling out scientific results at a rate that keeps them in their jobs. It does not serve the public.
Well, it wasn't supposed to be the science journalists' job to do this. There having been scientific malpractice, effectively, it then becomes the science journalist's job to discover the story and unearth it and figure out what it means. And sure, yes, absolutely, the science journalist should now be on it, but they're not. And I think, more to the point, when it's so clear that science, that the club of people that are doing science in any given domain is clearly just that. It's an insider's club, and you're either in or you're not. And if you're in, you're going to get your back patted and your grants granted, and your tenure review panel is going to be well stocked with friendlies, and you're going to proceed up the academic or perhaps corporate scientific ladder. And if you never had the expectation that your work would be challenged on the basis of whether or not it was good, if the entire game was played at the social level all along, that's not science. Science wasn't being done if it was entirely about who said that. If I like that guy, then that's a good thing he said. And if I don't like that guy, then that's not a good thing he said. That's not how science is supposed to work, because science is supposed to be about the process of discovering what is true, whether or not you like it. Whether or not the person saying the thing that is true is someone whom you like, whether or not the person who is saying the thing that is true is saying something that is true, but in other realms he says things that are unsavory. None of that is supposed to matter.
Yeah, it's not supposed to matter. And the fact that in this case, you're dealing with a bunch of things of consequence. And I agree with you that there's a level of complexity here that makes it hard to track. But
Sure.
Evolutionary biology scored a win. Right? Correctly predicted things without the necessity of laboratory evidence. On the basis of theory alone, there are a small number of such predictions in the history of evolutionary biology. We get to add another one, right? It actually works, right? That's an important piece of evidence about how significant this is, how much we should invest in evolutionary theory.
Also a bonus that it actually builds on one of the other major theoretical predictions, antagonistic pleiotropy from
George Williams,
1967?
No, 57.
57.
57.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So this is a great story. It's a multi-generational story of success of an evolutionary line of reasoning, a very elegant one, that ultimately arrives at a mechanism which you can validate in a laboratory study. That's pretty cool, right? It also, in the context of the hell that we have just gone through with COVID, right? You and I, yes, you and I were entitled to bring that success. Let's say we'd lost our minds. You and I have lost our minds, but we hadn't lost our minds 20 years ago, right? We are entitled to say, hey, here's a past success, and here's one where it took 2 decades for the field to catch up, right? So that raises the question, right? Are we now nuts, or are we just ahead, right? And the fact that this can be disappeared means that you and I are dismissible on the basis that, well, who are we? We're not even functioning academics, right? Okay, but so what? The point is, this is a significant success. And again, I don't want to be talking about this. I want somebody else to figure out whether this is significant, and I want to be able to stick to the scientific part of it. But if you've got effectively everybody across the board pretending that the hypothesis wasn't out there, that a interesting new result has emerged out of nowhere because some clever laboratory scientist thought to investigate the question, then the point is, well, okay, somebody's got to point out that there's in fact a hidden history here, which isn't all that hidden.
Well, and it also, so I have not read the New England Journal of Medicine article. I hadn't heard about any of this until shortly before we went on air here. But is it hypothesis driven? If it is, from whence the hypothesis is a question, and if it is not, this is not, I mean, you've already said it, I've already said it, we've already said it many, many times, but, you know, absent the preceding hypothesis, the work itself is not a test of anything. And so if any time people with fancy machines and computers fast enough to run very high-powered statistical tests say, oh, I can just collect a whole bunch of data over in that sphere and then see if any pattern emerges when I tell the computer to do some stuff, and go, aha, see, I found it. I go, what's that you found? Oh, well, it's the thing. Oh, let me see what I think that means. If you're trying to figure out what you think it means afterwards, that means that you were poking around in the dark. And poking around in the dark is not what science is supposed to be doing. Poking around in the dark is effectively, it's haphazard at best and random at worst.
This is poking around in a self-inflicted darkness, which is so strange because you think that scientists are out there trying to get ahead of each other, and that's, you know, it's sort of ugly that it's a competitive business, but it drives us to see things. These are people who are striving not to see what's in front of them. And here, let me show you. Zach, will you bring up the New York Times article, the Gina Colada article? Some organisms even have crazy long telomeres, like mice, said Dr. Benjamin Ebert, chairman of the medical oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And mice don't live that long. Okay? This is a sentence written in 2023 that says that mice have crazy long telomeres? Okay, now, can you bring up my article?
That's going to be on my computer, right? You have it? Okay.
And then, yeah, bring it up. And then scroll down to the end of the abstract, which I'm not going to be able to read. Maybe back up.
Yeah.
Up.
With their telomere, stop moving it. Where do you want me to start reading from?
We observe that captive rodent breeding protocols designed to increase reproductive output simultaneously exert strong selection against reproductive senescence and virtually eliminate senescence that would otherwise favor tumor suppression. This appears to have
selection.
Say again?
And virtually eliminates selection that would otherwise favor tumor suppression.
All right. This appears to have greatly elongated the telomeres of laboratory mice. With their telomeric failsafe effectively disabled, these animals are unreliable models of normal senescence and tumor formation. Safety tests employing these animals likely overestimate cancer risks and underestimate tissue damage and consequent accelerated senescence. So that is a scientific sentence. It was properly contextualized and was up to date in 2002. Mm-hmm. Gina Colada's article saying, you know, in fact, there were paradoxes. Mice have crazy long telomeres and they don't have long lives. That is a sentence that would have been foolish 20 years ago. In the current context, with this other result now having been validated, a telomere, a telomere-based Nobel Prize has been awarded. Carol Greider has given a Nobel lecture on telomere length in mice, in which she, like everything else here, describes things upside down. She pretends that the strangely long telomeres of laboratory mice are a good thing because of all the weird things they allow us to see. But nonetheless, it's not a secret, right? It is being dealt with in this bizarre way that prevents people from putting 2 and 2 together and getting 4. But nonetheless, it's not a secret. It's been discussed everywhere, but it's been discussed in a way that just does not allow credit to flow anywhere that is not preordained.
And it works in part because perhaps everyone, there may be a few odd people in the world for whom this is not true, but nearly everyone likes story, understands human interaction. And so this science journalism, so-called, is being told with quotations and a little bit of human interest and this and that and the other. And it's much more dry to keep up on the literature and go in and say, this is predicted here and here's what we have. It's much both easier and easier to sell the story to the editor, presumably, and to the readers of the New York Times. And, it would be the readers of anyone. I'm not particularly going after the readers of the New York Times here, to say, I'm gonna make a phone call to one of the trusty people in my, modern Rolodex, and get a quote that works and that feels really sciencey, and it also breaks up the dense scientific speak. And oughtn't that be good enough? Because they're the people who are paid to keep up on literature, aren't they? And so the failure is, yes, at the journalism level, but first it's at the scientist level. It's at the level of the people who are supposed to be doing the science and who are claiming to be doing the science and who are holding the torch for science and letting it go out.
Yes, but, at the beginning of that, you alluded to the narrative. And the fact is, the narrative of evolutionary biology seeing something that laboratory science didn't see or refused to see, and it having dramatic implications about human health, about our capacity to do future science, right? That's a good story, and there's a reason that it doesn't show up. And it's not because it isn't a good story. It's because that story is threatening to something that is in a position to snuff it out.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, deeply troubling. It's not that human health does not ride on the question of, was this knowable, right? This was knowable. It was knowable 20 years ago. It had implications. It's important in, for example, you and I were taken to task by Eric Topol on Sam Harris's podcast. Well, Eric Topol became famous, I believe, in the fight over what happened with Vioxx. So in some sense, his coming after us is 2 schools of thought on what happened with the Vioxx scandal. And our school of thought has just scored a major triumph, but it will not be recorded that way. And therefore, Eric Topol will still come to the battle as, the highly decorated professor. And, you and I are, I don't know, people who went to a college where teaching was the primary thing and, left during some bizarre meltdown, right? That's not how it is. Scientifically speaking, there's actually a track record on both sides, and the implication couldn't be more important for issues in the present, like public health policy during COVID, like pharmaceutical safety over that same period, like the evolutionary implications of vaccinating into a pandemic and what that had to do with the proliferation of variants. The point is, you are supposed to take your track record into that battle, and when you say something surprising, your track record is supposed to cause people to calibrate, right? Are you a crank? Well, if so, newly so, right? Because there's a long track record of being right about things in this area, surprising things, important things.
It was part of why, as much as many in the scientific and medical establishment wanted to do so, it was hard to dismiss Kary Mullis out of hand when he started saying things across a number of fields that you weren't supposed to say. And of course, the idea that there are things that you aren't supposed to say in a scientific domain is itself distinctly and should be immediately suspect. Like, that tells you right there that you're not playing in science land anymore, that this is something else.
Yeah, Carrie Mullis and Luc Montagnier. And I would say that to the extent that something like, Nobel Prizes are awarded for a reason, those guys both had one. And the point is, they came to any argument, no matter how counterintuitive what they were saying was, both of them came to the argument with the official sanction of the Nobel Prize. And that meant, yeah, they could easily be wrong. But the point is, the chances that they were wrong just because they didn't get it was pretty damn low, because they had gotten it to a level that exceeded what most people do in a career. And anyway, I guess I am simultaneously tickled to discover that, I gotta tell you, having been told as a graduate student that the fact that we grow feeble because we have a cancer protective mechanism, that idea wasn't interesting to nature's audience. I mean, it was obviously an insane thing for them to say at the time, but it is sort of fun to have the vindication of, oh, well, now everybody seems to be interested in that. Now that it didn't come from evolutionary science, it came from the laboratory. People are fascinated by this enough that the New York Times is all about it. But I am frustrated at the degree to which the failures of the system that is supposed to be, the system in which peers are reviewing each other's work to make sure it meets a certain quality. One of the things peer review is supposed to do is that people familiar with the area are supposed to tell you, oh, you failed to cite that result and you didn't account for that thing. So they're supposed to know it, and they're supposed to hold each other's feet to the fire over it. And it's not supposed to make it into the publication like New England Journal of Medicine unless it has, reached a standard of carefulness and thoroughness that it justifies publication there. That system doesn't exist, right? That system is more likely to force you to exclude things in order to make it into the club so that you don't, rock the boat for those who are, at the top of the field. That is deeply frustrating to me. And having watched so much harm done over the COVID pandemic by bad science being sold by bad journalism, right? It's just, this feels like, it is simultaneously a wonderful vindication and a slap in the face.
Yeah, that is what it is. And a demonstration that many are resolved to have learned nothing, which means next time it will be worse.
Yes, and we're still learning nothing.
Yeah, continue to learn nothing.
Yeah.